Welcome to the Aporde podcast, the show where we delve into the fascinating world of economics and its impact on global development. I'm your host, Nondwe Majundana, and today we have the privilege of sitting down with distinguished expert, economist and author Ha-Joon Chang, widely recognized for his contributions to development economics and has been at the forefront of research in this critical area. I can't do this whole introduction because this is such an amazing man in front of me, but he teaches economics at SOAS University of London, and he is the co-director of the Development Leadership Dialogue and the Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation at SOAS. He has written a number of journals, articles, books, published several authored books, and has 11 edited books. I understand one of them being the best-selling author, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. The one we will go a little bit into is the one I'm most interested in is edible economics. But before we get there, introduce yourself to my listeners. Welcome, Ha-Joon.
Hi. Thank you for having me on this show. I'm Ha-Joon Chang. I'm originally from South Korea, although I have lived 38 years in the UK, but I still keep my Korean passport and I'm still very Korean. I decided to study economics because I was growing up in South Korea at a time when we had so-called miracle growth and the economy, and as a result, the society was changing so much, so fast. So this is a time when the economy is growing at 8, 10, sometimes 12% in per capita terms. And every year you had new industries, new infrastructure, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people moving from rural areas to urban areas. Korea at the time was a very poor country. And I was born in the early 60s, our per capita income was less than half that of Ghana's, just about 1/3 that of Senegal's, and something like 1/6 that of South Africa's. And even though it had kind of very rapid growth throughout the 60s and 70s, even until the late 70s, our goal was to achieve $1,000 per capita income. So you can imagine, so at that level of income, the economic growth, of course, it has to be equitably distributed, which it was at the time, can do so much good for people's lives, it isn't just another, TV, another handbag. It's about living longer, not having to see your child die before it reaches 5 years of age, people being able to eat another bowl of rice and heating their houses a bit more in winter, being able to visit hospitals and pharmacies once more to deal with their illnesses. So there are a lot of positive things happening. But at the time, we also had the dark underbelly of development, if you like. This is something that all the industrialized countries went through in the beginning. We had at the time the longest working hours in the world. The government was very repressive, being a military dictatorship. Construction companies are hiring thugs to clear out the illegal settlements so that they could build apartment blocks for middle-class people. So I really wanted to understand what's going on because there were so many things happening there. And when I entered university, I realized that the kind of economics that most of the professors taught were quite useless in understanding what was going on around me because they were teaching very abstract equilibrium economics, supply and demand, external shocks, the market through invisible hand brings supply and demand in line. We couple professors who were from the more old school German historical school and people who studied economic history. And so we were given glimpses of what else lies beyond this abstract models. So those days we organized ourselves into study groups to read economists who are not taught that through regular courses.
And I love that. And to add to that, I think you're one of the economists that has been able to bridge the gap for other people to understand economics. So tell me a little bit about your book, because you're a hungry economist that tries to explain it to the world. I know Korean culture is so filled with food. That's and right. That is core and integral to your culture. But I would like you to tell me why edible economics.
I have written quite a few kind of mass market books. You already mentioned 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism, but there is Bad Samaritans, Economics, the User's Guide. So at least in the last 2 decades, I have been writing for the general public, but I really wanted to reach out to people who don't normally pick up even economics books. Once they pick it up, I think I'm pretty good at explaining things, how to even make people pick up an economics book. So I decided to use this trick of, mixing food with economics. And actually on the Amazon sites, I occasionally come across reviews which say that, I picked up this book thinking that this is a book about food. And then I realized it's not. It's just using food stories to talk about economics.
I love that.
And, I'm very passionate about economics, but also very passionate about food. And
I can tell.
But I've been writing for the general public because I'm increasingly convinced that this is the right thing to do because, in this capitalist societies, especially in the neoliberal version of it, which puts so much emphasis on market and price and value, and I come to realize that if people don't know at least some basic things about economics, democracy is meaningless. Under neoliberalism, we've been forced to think everything through the lens of economics, whether it's about conservation of the wildlife or funding of museums or funding of, teaching of ancient languages in universities. Everything is now supposed to justify its existence in terms of the economic value it creates. And in that kind of society, if you don't know economics, you are basically, voting for, talent show, I like the look of that guy, she sings well and so on, So that if you want to make democracy meaningful, it is vital that people know at least some economics, and it's
are able to make better decisions for
exactly,
themselves and their communities. I love that you speak about the growth of South Korea, that inspired your childhood to go into economics. But when I started picking up the book, I was fascinated to learn about, garlic and what it means for the Asian culture. I know you guys from mukbangs, and I think there's a bit of a rise in sudden South Korean interest. I don't know what's driving it. It might be the mukbangs, it might be the anime, it may be even, I don't know, the Korean singing groups that but I definitely appreciate that as a culture. Food really focuses you guys and grounds you and really grows you. And a mukbang, for people who don't know, was started originally to share food with people when you are not within a community setting. So I found it quite interesting to see so much garlic in all of them. And I was like, why is she having another third, fourth, sixth garlic? And then when I read the book, I understood you guys go through 7 kgs of garlic.
It's in our foundation myth of all things. So the books are quite a weird book in the sense that, each chapter is named after food ingredients. So the first chapter is garlic, and then there's acorn and anchovies and coconuts. But the food story is usually not central to the subsequent economic story that I analyze. Very often it's just an excuse to draw people in. Sometimes it is central in the chapters like anchovies. It is central to the story, but usually it's not. So it's kind of a fun way of kind of drawing people into economics, but also a lot of these food stories contain histories of colonialism, imperialism, racism,
Definitely that coconut chapter.
That's right, the coconut chapter was written to dispute this common myth that in the rich countries that poor countries are poor because their people are lazy, quote unquote.
People of color.
That's right, brown people, that lying beneath a coconut tree for the brown fruit to fall, that kind of trope. So there are some chapters where the food story is actually quite central to the economic story, but sometimes it has nothing really to do with the main story. For example, there's a chapter on chicken, which somehow is transformed into a story about inequality. No one without actually reading the book would be able to guess how I take it from chicken to inequality.
I could guess, but
you did,
South African.
Excellent.
I could definitely guess from the dumpling. Yeah. But thank you so much for taking us to those inequalities. What do you think really is the critical moment in development countries to be able to address those inequalities?
Yeah, inequalities, I think the most important thing about inequalities is that it can be changed, yeah? So, for example, in 1995, Brazil and South Africa basically had similar levels of inequality. Yeah? And since then, Brazil, of course, with disruption with this guy Bolsonaro, but had a kind of center-left government which rolled out many social policies, especially the famous Bolsa Familia program. And it has actually managed to significantly reduce its inequality. Its Gini coefficient fell from something like 0.6 to 0.5. Yeah. So, it's still very high by international standard, but it's a significant fall, whereas in South Africa, income inequality has actually risen from 0.6 to around 0.65, yeah?
Especially after COVID.
That's right, yeah. So the first thing when you have to realize that when talking about inequality is not a natural phenomenon, it's something that happens because there are particular structures of the economy in terms of the land ownership, corporate ownership, people's entitlement to social welfare and so on, and also partly due to the kind of deliberate attempts to change or not change inequalities through various social policies and other tools. So that's the most important thing. But of course, saying this doesn't mean that you can erase 500 years of colonial history and racism and so on overnight. Yeah. So you have to accept the structural constraints that your underlying socio-economic factors create. The worst thing is to believe there is something that has to happen,
and should happen, and can happen.
That's right, yeah. I just gave you an example of contrast between Brazil and South Africa, but for example, in the rich countries, it has become very popular to explain increasing inequality by globalization. Yeah? So now Western workers are competing with Chinese workers, so that they have to now accept lower wages and so on. But if you actually look at the income distribution data of different countries, there are actually quite a few countries where income inequality has not risen in the last 4 decades of globalization. Yeah? So France, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Canada, in those countries, income inequality has either risen tiny bit, like in Canada and the Netherlands, or stayed the same or even slightly fallen, depending on which data you look at, like in Switzerland and France. Yeah. But if it was globalization and trade with China that was driving increasing inequality, how come countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland, which are very small, very open economies, do not experience rise in inequality, whereas the US, which is quite a closed economy because of its size, sees a huge increase in inequality. So it needs to be explained through changes in the behaviors of corporations, weakening of the unions, and the changing corporate culture, which used to have a ratio between top salaries and average salaries in corporations in the region of 30 to 40, which already was at quite high by international standard, and it's routine to have that figure in the range of 300, 400. Yeah? You need to explain these things with quite critical lens, because it's so easy to blame it on the Chinese, to blame it on this and that, something that cannot be controlled by national governments.
Yeah, I like that you touch on some of these inequalities, and let's take it back quickly as we close off. Back to the point of you being here in South Africa this week. You are here for the Development Leadership Dialogue, FLP program alongside IPPM and Aporde, working with these government officials to really see, and trade unionists and other organizations, to really work with these economists to bring solutions to Africa. What would you say is something that for you, a low-hanging fruit, or something that's really you think could be driven as you are here today to deliver some of the lectures this week? What would you say to these young and older economists who are driving change in Africa?
Yeah, no, I've been engaged in this kind of capacity building programs in developing world for nearly 25 years now. I mean, I started with this program called Capitalism, Cambridge Advanced Program on Rethinking Development Economics, that ran between 2001 and 2008 in Cambridge, England, basically training young professors in alternative development economics. So even then, I made sure that we invite some people working in the governments, private sector, international organizations, but they were mainly focused on the academics. And then the South Africans that took that torch over and started running the Aporde program from 2004, I think. And that program focused more on the younger policymakers. And then now IPPM has been focusing on older policymakers. And this year we have got together with DLD, Development Leadership Institute, at SOAS, to create a joint program between IPPM and our Future Leaders program, basically targeting people who'd be in hopefully leadership position in the next 5 to 10 years. So we are doing this at multiple levels. The young professors, young policymakers, older policymakers. And what we want to achieve with all this is not to feed these people with our own recipes for countries that we don't necessarily know very well.
But there's quite a lot. There's about 17 different countries represented.
Exactly. To open people's mind to the fact that a lot of things that the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the mainstream economists in places like Harvard and Chicago and Oxford tell you are not really based on facts. And also to encourage people to think independently, but also think pragmatically, because if you look at real world success cases, you see some very, very unusual combinations. I mean, I can give you one example given the time constraint. For example, take the case of Singapore, one of the most successful economies in the world. And when you hear about Singapore in the kind of mainstream economics textbooks or in the financial press, you will only hear about this free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has, but you will never hear that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government, 85% of the housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation, and staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines.
What a dream for South Africa.
Yeah, exactly. So, I challenge my graduate students. Look, give me one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore. There's no such theory because it's the result of very pragmatic choices about what it should do, what it can do, given the circumstances, geopolitics, its location, its size, its goals. And if you go deeper, all successful countries had these very, very unusual combinations. And by talking about these examples, I really want to encourage people that we need to build our own model. Of course, exactly, I mean, because you are all facing different conditions in terms of population, location, stages of development, natural resource endowment, the skill levels, education levels. And
let me stop you there with the natural endowments. I mean, the theme for this year is green industrialization in Africa. So just to summarize for me what the priorities are for Africa as the continent with these endowments.
Yeah, basically it should try to find a way to use these natural resources that are in high demand for this green transition on a global scale as a springboard to diversify and upgrade the economy. I mean, this is very important because in the current discourse, the rich countries are basically saying, well, we have the technologies, we have the money, we'll give you a bit of money to shut down your coal industry and we'll sell you the green technologies so that you can be part of this green transition. I mean, that's better than nothing, but it's going to basically preserve the existing international division of labor where African countries, Latin American countries, they are mostly producing the raw materials and all the values are added elsewhere. Yeah? And you don't have the control over the technologies that you use. I mean, I don't want to name a particular country, but, if an African country builds a huge amount of solar farms and produces green hydrogen that is turned into ammonia and exported to Europe, East Asia, North America, what's the difference between that and another African country pumping oil out of the ground? Yeah,
yeah,
it's the same.
A lot of the carbon emissions are coming from the transportation alone.
Yeah, that too. But these resources do not do anything to lift the economy to a higher level. Yeah? So African countries need to develop a strategy to use this to develop at least some industries, yeah, and create new jobs, new technologies, and new opportunities for business development.
Thank you so much for shedding your light on these critical intersections of climate change and the urgencies, and how you will be imparting all of that knowledge to these future leaders, because apparently we're already 5 years too late in building these technologies. The climate urgency is here, it's real, but the global value chains in Africa need to really industrialize and be supported to be strategic in that industrial policy. Right, yeah. So thank you so much for your insights. They've been invaluable. Thank you so much to our guest, Ha-Joon. We are going to have actually a dinner tonight with him. That's so right. Catch us on our social media platforms. Thank you to our listeners for joining another episode of the Aporde and IPPM podcast. I'm your host. Hope you have found this discussion as enlightening as I did. And if you have any questions or you want to continue this conversation, feel free to reach out to us on Aporde website. That's www.aporde.co.za, as well as all our social media pages on the Aporde Alumni Network. Remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your network. Your support helps us continue to bring engaging content on economics and global development. Thank you, Ha-Joon.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.